Hey, welcome back to Sleepy Old World. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Wherever you are in the world, whatever kind of day you've had, pull your blanket a little closer, settle into whatever position feels most comfortable. Maybe dim the lights if you haven't already, or let the soft glow of your screen be the only thing in the room with you right now. Tonight we're doing something a little different. Tonight we're going somewhere that's part history, part kitchen wisdom, part quiet revelation about a world that existed not so very long ago, and yet feels in some ways like it belongs to a completely different civilization. We're going back to the 1950s. Not to the chrome and the tail fins and the television sets. We're going somewhere more intimate than that. We're going to the table, to the refrigerator, to the handwritten recipe cards tucked into the back of kitchen drawers, to the food that American women were actually eating in that era, how they thought about it, what it did for them, and why so much of that knowledge quietly vanished in the decades that followed. Before we begin, if you enjoy these slow, curious journeys through history, it would mean a great deal to me if you subscribe to Sleepy Old World. This channel exists entirely because of people who find their way here at night, looking for something gentle and interesting. And every single subscriber genuinely helps keep it going. It makes me more grateful than I know how to properly express. So if this feels like the right kind of company for a late evening, please do subscribe and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from tonight, because I read every single one. Now, let us go back. Picture a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1953. A woman in a small house somewhere in Ohio is standing at her kitchen counter. The kitchen smells of coffee and something faintly sweet. The last warmth from the morning toast still hanging in the air. She's slender. Not the kind of slender that comes from a punishing regimen or a Spartan relationship with food, but the naturally proportioned slenderness of someone who has simply eaten a certain way her entire life without particularly thinking about it. She doesn't count anything. She doesn't weigh herself every morning. She doesn't own a single book with the word diet in the title. What she owns is a collection of index cards covered in her own handwriting, her mother's handwriting, her grandmother's handwriting, a living archive of the food that the women in her family have always made, always eaten, always carried forward through the generations as naturally as a language. She's making lunch. A plate of sliced cold meat, pale and firm. A small bowl of cottage cheese with a few canned peach halves arranged beside it. A couple of celery stalks, crisp and cool, pulled from the icebox. A glass of whole milk so cold there is condensation forming on the outside of the glass. No bread. Not because she's afraid of bread, but because this is what lunch looks like on a Tuesday. Light. Enough. A meal assembled from memory and habit rather than calculation. By modern standards, this meal would be considered almost aggressively simple. By the standards of the era in which it was made, it was entirely normal. It was what women ate. And the remarkable thing, the thing I want to spend the next several hours exploring with you, is that what women in the 1950s ate bore almost no resemblance to what we think they ate. And the way they thought about food bore almost no resemblance to the way we think about it now, and the results, in terms of health and body composition and daily energy, were in many documented ways genuinely extraordinary by comparison to what came after. This is not a simple story of the old ways being better. Nothing in history is ever that simple. But it is a story about food that got lost, about wisdom that was quietly overwritten, about a particular relationship between women and what they ate that existed in that narrow window of the post-war decade and then faded, replaced by something that promised more and delivered considerably less. So let us begin at the beginning. Let us begin with what was actually in the refrigerator. In the early 1950s, the average American refrigerator was a different object from what sits in your kitchen today. Not just physically, though it was certainly different physically, but conceptually. What it contained, what a household expected to find inside it, what counted as properly stocked, all of it operated according to different logic. There were no frozen convenience meals because frozen convenience food as a category barely existed yet. There were no rows of flavoured yogurt in individual plastic containers, no pre-washed salad bags, no hummus tubs, no string cheese individually wrapped in plastic. What there was food. Actual, recognisable, uncomplicated food in its natural or minimally processed state. A well-stocked 1950s refrigerator held whole milk, usually in a glass bottle that the milkman had left on the front step that morning. It held butter, real butter, not margarine in the better households, though margarine had begun its long aggressive campaign to replace butter in this era and was already winning significant ground. There were eggs, a dozen at least, because eggs were central to the daily diet in a way they no longer are. There were cuts of meat wrapped in butcher paper, a small leftover piece of something from Sunday's dinner, some cold cuts. There was a block of natural cheese, the kind that came in a paper wrapper from the dairy counter, sharp cheddar or mild American, not the processed orange slices that were beginning to appear on grocery shelves. There were vegetables, real ones, a head of iceberg lettuce, some celery, a few carrots, perhaps a leftover cooked beet or two from last night's supper. There were canned goods in the pantry rather than the refrigerator rows of them, because canned vegetables and fruits were one of the primary ways that households in this era ate produce that wasn't currently in season. And there were fermented things, modest and unassuming, jars of dill pickles, a jar of sauerkraut, perhaps some homemade relish. What was conspicuously absent from this refrigerator is almost as interesting as what was present. There was very little sugar outside the sugar bowl on the counter. There were almost no sweet drinks, because sweet drinks in daily life were not yet the norm they would become. The processed snack foods that would begin flooding the market in the late 1950s and accelerate dramatically through the 1960s were not yet there. The seed oils, the vegetable oils, the highly refined fats that would come to dominate American cooking by the 1970s, those were largely absent too. The shortening in the pantry was probably Crisco or a similar hydrogenated vegetable product, which has its own complicated story. But the cooking fat most women reached for first on a daily basis was still, in the early part of the decade at least, animal fat. Lard from a can. Bacon drippings saved in a jar beside the stove. Butter. This was the kitchen that produced the woman standing at the counter with her Tuesday lunch. And understanding what was in that kitchen is the first step toward understanding what made her eat the way she did, which is the first step toward understanding why she looked the way she did. Let us talk about protein, because protein is where this story begins to get genuinely interesting. The 1950s, American woman ate more protein than her modern counterpart does, and she ate it in a different way. Protein was not a supplement. It was not something she added to a smoothie. It was simply breakfast, lunch, and dinner in ways that have quietly eroded since then. Eggs in the morning, almost without exception. Meat at lunch, even if only in the modest form of cold cuts or leftover chicken. Meat or fish at dinner, prepared simply, served with vegetables, occasionally supplemented by potatoes or bread, but never buried under them. The science behind why this mattered has taken decades to properly articulate, but the women of the 1950s had arrived at the same conclusion through a completely different route, which was simply that eating this way felt right, kept them full, kept their energy even, and was what their mothers had eaten and their mothers' mothers before that. The body's response to adequate protein is not mysterious in retrospect. Protein is more satiating than carbohydrates or fat. It raises the metabolic rate slightly during digestion. It preserves muscle mass, which determines in large part how efficiently the body burns calories at rest. It regulates appetite hormones in ways that carbohydrate-heavy diets do not. A woman eating 2 eggs in the morning was not, by any calculation, eating a lavish breakfast. But she was eating a breakfast that would keep hunger at bay for several hours in a way that a bowl of sweetened cereal, the breakfast that would increasingly replace eggs through the 1960s and 1970s, simply could not match. And here is something worth dwelling on for a moment. The transition away from protein-centered breakfast was not accidental, and it was not driven by nutrition science. It was driven by marketing. The cereal companies had been working for decades to establish their products as the modern, convenient, scientific alternative to the old-fashioned egg and bacon breakfast. By the early 1950s, they were beginning to win that battle in a very significant way. The television commercial, that new and extraordinarily powerful medium that was just arriving in American living rooms in these years, became the vehicle through which breakfast was redefined. Cheerful animated characters and athletic young people smiling over bowls of sweetened corn puffs began to crowd out the quiet authority of the egg, not immediately, not all at once, but steadily, and with the backing of enormous amounts of money. The woman standing at her counter in 1953 still had her eggs, but her daughter, eating breakfast in front of the television a decade later, would likely be reaching for a box with a cartoon on it. And her granddaughter, a decade after that, eating on the go in a car, would have neither. But let us stay in 1953 for now. Let us stay in the kitchen, where things were still mostly as they had been. The cottage cheese on that Tuesday lunch plate deserves its own moment of attention, because cottage cheese was one of the signature foods of the 1950s woman in a way that has almost no cultural parallel today. It appeared constantly. It appeared on diet plates at restaurants, paired with a canned peach half and a few crackers. It appeared as a side dish at home. It appeared in salads, folded into gelatin moulds, spooned onto slices of canned fruit. Women ate it with a naturalness that suggests it genuinely satisfied something in them, rather than merely filling a prescribed slot in a reducing diet. Cottage cheese in the 1950s was not the watery, underflavoured product that many people encounter today. It was made from whole milk, and it was rich and slightly tangy with a curd texture that felt substantial. A cup of it contained roughly 25 grams of protein, virtually no sugar, moderate fat, and not very many calories by any reasonable measure. It was filling in the way that only protein-rich foods are filling, not the temporary fullness that comes from a large plate of starch and then evaporates an hour later, but the quieter, more lasting satisfaction of having given the body something it actually needed. The canned peach alongside it was not just a garnish or a concession to sweetness. It was a small serving of fruit, providing natural sugar in a modest amount, some fibre, some vitamin C. The pairing of protein and a small amount of natural fruit was intuitive, practical, and from what we now understand about blood sugar management, genuinely sound. The natural sugars in the fruit, absorbed alongside the protein and fat of the cottage cheese, entered the bloodstream gradually rather than in a spike. No crash, no sudden hunger returning within the hour, just steady, even energy through the rest of the afternoon. Let us follow her through the rest of that Tuesday, because the whole picture matters. Sometime in the late afternoon she might have a cup of tea, not a sweet tea, not an elaborate latte with flavoured syrup, just plain tea, perhaps with a small amount of milk, perhaps without. In some households a piece of plain fruit, an apple eaten whole, skin and all, or a few crackers with a thin slice of cheese. The evening snack culture that would eventually become endemic in America. The bowl of chips in front of the television, the ice cream from the carton, the late-night delivery, none of that existed in any recognisable form yet. Dinner was the main meal of the day in terms of quantity and composition. A piece of meat, probably something relatively inexpensive because most families were operating on tight post-war budgets. Chuck roast braised low and slow in the oven. Pork chops browned in the skillet with a little lard and then finished with onions. Chicken, which in the 1950s was not the cheap everyday protein it would later become, but was still considered a somewhat special purchase. Liver, because liver was cheap and nutrient-dense and women knew it, even if they didn't necessarily love it, and you ate what was economical and good for you without requiring your food to also be a source of constant pleasure. Alongside the meat came vegetables, usually cooked, often simply. Green beans from the garden, canned if it was winter, boiled until tender and finished with a small amount of butter. Beets pickled in vinegar and sugar, served cold as a side dish. Creamed corn from a can, mixed with a little butter and sometimes a tiny amount of sugar. Mashed potatoes on Sunday perhaps, but not every night. Bread on the table, real bread made from wheat flour, sliced and served in a basket but not the centerpiece of the meal. A condiment of the meal perhaps, something to sop up the sauce, not something to eat in quantity as the main event. And the butter was real. This is worth saying again because it matters more than it might seem to. The butter on the table in that kitchen in 1953 was not a guilty pleasure or an indulgence. It was simply food, the way it had always been food, for centuries before anyone thought to question it. Butter contains saturated fat, yes. And the story of what was done to saturated fat's reputation in American nutritional culture over the following decades is one of the most consequential and in many ways most troubling stories in the history of public health advice. But we are not in the future yet. We are in 1953, and in 1953 the butter was on the table, and the woman eating it was lean. Now let us talk about the one piece of deliberate food management that many 1950s women did engage in, because this is where the story gets unexpectedly sophisticated. The concept of calorie counting as such was not widely practiced in the early 1950s. Women did not, as a rule, sit down with a notebook and calculate their daily intake, but there was something they did do, something that functioned as an informal, intuitive version of portion awareness that was everywhere in the food culture of the era, and that has largely been lost. It was called the reducing plate, and it was served in restaurants, prescribed in women's magazines, eaten without particular fanfare at kitchen tables across the country. The reducing plate in its most common form was not a diet meal in the modern sense of a low-fat, artificially sweetened, calorie-engineered product. It was simply a plate of real food served in modest proportions, composed according to logic that prioritized satiety and nutrition over volume. Typically it included a portion of protein, a small serving of fruit or a modest vegetable, and nothing else. No bread, no starch, no large amounts of anything. The portion sizes were smaller than the main course plates, and the composition was deliberately designed to keep a woman satisfied without overwhelming her system. The reducing plate existed because women in the 1950s were aware of their weight in a way that was culturally pervasive and socially pressured, and we should be honest about that. The idealized female body of the 1950s was slim, waist-emphasized, curvaceous but not heavy, and the pressure to conform to that ideal was real, and sometimes unkind. We should not romanticize that dimension of the era, but the method that women actually used to manage their weight, the food they actually turned to when they wanted to be careful, was so much more nutritionally intelligent than the method that would replace it in the following decades that the contrast is genuinely startling. When a woman in 1955 wanted to lose a few pounds, she ate less. She ate more carefully. She chose the cottage cheese over the mashed potatoes, the broiled chicken over the pot roast. She did not eliminate fat. She did not substitute artificial sweeteners for real sugar. She did not drink a liquid meal replacement through a straw. She simply ate real food in smaller amounts with a clear eye toward protein and vegetables and modest fruit. And it worked, because that is actually how the human body works. Not because of any particular magic, but because of basic physiology that has not changed and will not change regardless of how many different dietary theories cycle through the culture. The women's magazines of the 1950s are a remarkable archive of this approach, and they repay careful reading. Magazines like Good Housekeeping and Ladies' Home Journal and Woman's Day ran regular features on what they called sensible reducing, and what they recommended bears almost no resemblance to the crash diets and low-fat regimens that would flood those same publications within a decade or two. A typical reducing plan from a 1953 issue of Good Housekeeping might suggest the following for a woman wanting to lose weight carefully: eggs for breakfast, scrambled or poached, a glass of tomato juice, no toast, cottage cheese and fruit for lunch, perhaps a small cup of vegetable soup made from scratch with no thickener, a piece of broiled fish or chicken for dinner, with a generous serving of cooked vegetables dressed lightly with butter, a glass of whole milk, A piece of fresh fruit as a dessert if desired. There is no diet food in this plan. There is no artificial sweetener. There is no low-fat anything. The entire approach is built around real food eaten in reasonable amounts, with a particular emphasis on protein and vegetables over starch and sugar. Read again. It is actually a quite reasonable, physiologically sound approach to weight management, and it predates by decades the formal research that would eventually vindicate protein-centered diets as more effective for fat loss and satiety than the high-carbohydrate, low-fat approaches that would replace them. The metabolic logic of what these women were doing intuitively without any scientific vocabulary for it is something I want to take a moment to explain, because I find it genuinely fascinating that the intuition arrived so clearly before the science did. When you eat a meal centered around protein, several things happen in the body that do not happen when you eat a meal centered around refined carbohydrates. Protein triggers the release of satiety hormones that signal to the brain that the body has been fed. It has a higher thermic effect than either fat or carbohydrates, meaning the body burns more calories simply in the process of digesting it. It slows the rate at which food moves through the digestive system, which means blood sugar rises more gradually and the return of hunger is delayed. And perhaps most importantly for a woman managing her weight through a decade of fairly constant domestic labor, it preserves lean muscle mass during periods of reduced calorie intake, which keeps the metabolic rate from dropping as sharply as it does on purely restrictive diets. The 1950s woman eating her cottage cheese and canned peach half for lunch was, in effect, running a high-protein, moderate-fat, low-sugar diet without knowing that is what she was doing. She was just eating what her mother had told her to eat when she wanted to be careful. And now let us talk about fat, because the story of dietary fat in the 1950s and what happened to it is one of the most important and least understood chapters in the history of American health. In the early 1950s, fat was food. This is the sentence that requires the most adjustment for the modern reader, because we have spent so many decades being told that fat, and specifically saturated fat, is a primary contributor to heart disease, weight gain, and general metabolic dysfunction, that it takes a genuine effort of imagination to inhabit a time when none of that was understood or believed. Because the hypothesis that dietary saturated fat causes heart disease by raising blood cholesterol was not established scientific consensus in 1953. It was a theory being proposed by one very influential and very determined man named Anchal Keys, and it had not yet won the culture, though it was in the process of doing so. Before Keys' ideas took hold, fat was something that women cooked with freely, ate without anxiety, and relied on for flavor, satiety, and the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins that the body cannot access any other way. Vitamins A, D, E, and K are fat-soluble, meaning they exist primarily in fatty foods and require dietary fat for absorption. A woman eating butter and whole eggs and fatty cuts of meat was getting vitamins that a woman avoiding fat was not getting, regardless of what vegetables she ate alongside her lean protein. This is not a trivial detail. It goes directly to the question of why 1950s women tended to have clear skin, strong nails, consistent energy, and a hormonal balance that many women today describe as elusive or difficult to maintain. Vitamin D, which is found in egg yolks, fatty fish, and butter, plays a role in mood regulation, immune function, bone density, and hormonal health. A woman eating eggs and butter every day was getting modest but consistent amounts of it. A woman eating fat-free yogurt and lean chicken breast is getting essentially none, and relying on sunlight alone, which in many climates is insufficient for several months of the year. Vitamin A, the form that exists in animal fats rather than the beta-carotene that converts to vitamin A imperfectly in the body, is critical for skin health, vision, immune function, and reproductive health. Butter and liver and egg yolks are among the richest sources of preformed vitamin A in the food supply. The women eating these things in 1953 were, however unknowingly, maintaining nutrient levels that directly supported the physical appearance and vitality that the era became associated with. There is a phrase that food historians use when discussing the dietary shift of the post-war decades, which is the nutrition transition. It refers to the broad pattern of change in which populations move away from traditional whole food diets toward processed industrialized food patterns typically with consequences for health and body composition that take a generation or two to fully manifest. The United States underwent a dramatic nutrition transition beginning in the 1950s and accelerating through the 1960s, 1970s and beyond. And the foods that went first, the animal fats replaced by vegetable oils, the whole eggs replaced by egg white products, the whole milk replaced by skimmed alternatives, were precisely the foods that had been providing the fat-soluble vitamins, the fatty acids, the hormonal building blocks that women's bodies needed, the butter going off the table. That is where a part of this story turns. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. Let us go more slowly. Let us go food by food through the things that 1950s women ate regularly and why each one of them mattered, because I think the details are what make this real rather than abstract. Let us talk about eggs. The egg is perhaps the single most nutritionally complete food that exists, not because of any mystical property, but because an egg contains by necessity everything required to grow a complete organism from a single cell. Every vitamin, every essential amino acid, every mineral needed for life exists in an egg in proportions that the body can use efficiently. A single large egg contains approximately 6 grams of protein, 5 grams of fat, and virtually no carbohydrates. It contains vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K, vitamin B12, folate, choline, selenium, phosphorus, zinc, and lutein and zeaxanthin, which protect eye health. It is, by any nutritional accounting, one of the most efficient foods available to the human body, and the women of the 1950s ate 2 of them for breakfast, every morning, without particular ceremony or gratitude, because eggs were simply what you had for breakfast, the way previous generations had always had them. The choline content alone is worth pausing on. Choline is a nutrient that is essential for liver health, brain function, fat metabolism, and the production of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which is involved in memory and muscle control. It is not synthesized in adequate amounts by the body and must come from food. The richest dietary sources of choline are egg yolks, liver, and fatty fish, all foods that were central to the 1950s diet and all foods that have been significantly reduced in average American consumption in the decades since. Choline deficiency has been linked in more recent research to fatty liver disease, cognitive decline, and metabolic dysfunction. The women eating 2 eggs every morning were getting adequate choline virtually without trying. Many women today are not. The cholesterol content of eggs became their undoing in the cultural imagination. When Ancel Keys' hypothesis about dietary fat and heart disease took hold in American public health messaging in the late 1950s and especially through the 1960s, egg yolks, being rich in both fat and cholesterol, became a casualty of the war on saturated fat. By the mid-1970s, nutritional guidelines were actively recommending that Americans limit their egg consumption, and millions of women who had been eating 2 eggs for breakfast their whole lives stopped or began eating only the whites, discarding the yolks that contained virtually all of the egg's nutritional value. What they threw away in those yolks, literally and figuratively, represents one of the more profound nutritional ironies of the 20th century. The part of the egg that had been feeding human beings for most of human history, the part that contained all the fat-soluble vitamins, all the choline, all the essential fatty acids, the part that made the egg the most nutritionally complete food in the traditional diet. That was the part that a generation of well-meaning public health messaging taught people to fear and discard. The eggs are back in fashion now, more or less. The official guidance on dietary cholesterol has been substantially revised in recent years, and the scientific consensus has largely moved away from the simple dietary fat equals blood cholesterol equals heart disease model that drove anti-egg messaging for so long. But the habit, the cultural norm of reaching for the egg every morning, the unthinking confidence of the woman cracking 2 eggs into the skillet at 6:30 on a Tuesday, that has not come back. That particular ease is gone. Let us talk about liver, because liver is perhaps the most instructive food in this entire story, the food that most dramatically illustrates the gap between what the 1950s kitchen knew intuitively and what the modern kitchen has forgotten entirely. Liver was a regular feature of the 1950s dinner table, not celebrated, not exotic, just present in the weekly rotation with a matter-of-factness that tells you everything about how it was regarded. It was cheap, it was readily available. It was considered good for you, specifically good for the blood, for energy, for general vitality, in a way that older generations understood from observation even without knowing the mechanism. And it was eaten, especially by women and children, with a regularity that is almost impossible to imagine in contemporary food culture, where liver has largely disappeared from anything except the most committed traditional cooking households. The nutritional profile of beef liver is something that, if it were discovered in a laboratory today and packaged as a supplement, would be considered a breakthrough. A single 3-ounce serving of beef liver contains enormous amounts of vitamin A, more vitamin B12 than virtually any other food, significant amounts of riboflavin, folate, vitamin B6, copper, selenium, zinc, iron in the highly bioavailable heme form, and roughly 23 grams of high-quality protein. It is sometimes described by nutritional scientists as the most nutrient-dense food in the traditional food supply, calorie for calorie providing more essential nutrients than any other single ingredient. Iron in the heme form that liver contains is absorbed by the body at a rate of 15 to 35%. Iron in the non-heme form found in plant foods is absorbed at a rate of 2 to 15%, and its absorption is further inhibited by a range of other dietary compounds. A woman eating liver once a week was maintaining iron stores that plant-based iron sources cannot easily replicate. Iron deficiency is one of the most common nutritional deficiencies in women of reproductive age globally, and it manifests not just as anemia in severe cases, but as fatigue, poor concentration, reduced physical endurance, and lowered immunity in its more common subclinical forms. The women of the 1950s, eating liver and other organ meats and red meat and egg yolks, were not iron deficient in the ways that became common in subsequent generations, who replaced these foods with plant-centered, lower iron alternatives. The recipe cards for liver from this era are illuminating in themselves. Liver and onions was the standard preparation, the one that appears in virtually every general cookbook of the period. The liver sliced thin, dredged lightly in seasoned flour, cooked quickly in a hot pan with fat, finished with caramelized onions that provided sweetness and texture to balance the mineral intensity of the meat. Made well, with good liver that has not been overcooked, it is genuinely delicious. Made poorly, which it often was in school cafeterias and domestic kitchens where the cook was going through the motions without real engagement, it could be chalky and bitter and deeply unpleasant, which is how it acquired the reputation that eventually drove it from the table. But what was lost when the liver went, when women stopped making it because their children complained, and their husbands had grown up with bad cafeteria versions, and no one was advocating for it anymore, was a weekly nutrient delivery that genuinely made a difference to the body. The vitamin B12 that prevented neurological problems, the copper that supported iron metabolism and connective tissue health, the vitamin A that kept skin clear and immune function strong, the folate that was particularly critical for women of childbearing age, all of it gone from most tables to be partially replaced by supplements in pill form that the body absorbs less efficiently and that most women take inconsistently. Now let us talk about a category of foods that is almost invisible in the 1950s kitchen because it was so completely unremarkable at the time, and which has since acquired an entire cultural apparatus of complexity around it, as if it were a new discovery rather than one of the oldest categories of human food. Let us talk about fermented foods. The 1950s kitchen contained fermented foods without ceremony or explanation. Dill pickles in the refrigerator door, the genuine fermented kind made with brine and dill and garlic rather than vinegar and sugar, which is what most modern pickles are. Sauerkraut in a jar in the pantry, often homemade or bought from a local deli, containing live cultures of lactobacillus bacteria that are among the best studied beneficial organisms in gut health research. Buttermilk, the real fermented kind, drunk cold as a beverage or used in baking, containing bacteria and organic acids that support digestive function. Kefir in certain European immigrant households, the fermented milk drink that contains a broader and more diverse community of beneficial organisms than almost any commercial probiotic product. Aged natural cheeses, hard cheddar, sharp American, the kind made from raw or minimally processed milk by traditional methods, that contain their own communities of live cultures as part of their fermentation. None of this was called probiotic. None of it was marketed for gut health. It was just food, the way it had been food for thousands of years, the way every culture on Earth had arrived at some version of fermented food independently, because human beings had figured out long before biochemistry existed that fermented foods made them feel good and kept them well. The gut microbiome, the community of microorganisms that inhabits the human digestive system and influences everything from immune function to mood to weight regulation to skin health, is a relatively recent subject of intense scientific research, but the dietary wisdom that supported a healthy microbiome is ancient. A woman eating fermented pickles and sauerkraut and aged cheese and buttermilk regularly, as the 1950s woman did without thinking about it, was maintaining a diversity and robustness in her gut bacteria that the modern woman eating ultra-processed foods, pasteurized dairy products, and vegetables treated with multiple rounds of pesticides and antibiotic interventions is significantly less likely to achieve. The research on gut microbiome diversity and its relationship to body weight and fat storage has become particularly compelling in recent years. Studies have found that a more diverse gut microbiome is associated with healthier weight maintenance independent of caloric intake, and that the strains most strongly associated with leanness are precisely those fed and sustained by the kinds of fermented and whole foods that characterized the traditional American diet before the food processing revolution. The woman eating her dill pickle from the jar in the refrigerator door was, in ways that could not have been articulated in 1953, maintaining a gut environment that supported the metabolic health that kept her lean. Let us turn to vegetables now, because the way vegetables were eaten in the 1950s is another dimension of this story that deserves careful attention. The vegetables of the 1950s kitchen were not the carefully curated, organically grown, expensively packaged specialty items that vegetables have become in some cultural contexts today. They were ordinary, inexpensive, sometimes canned, often cooked long past the point of nutritional fashion, and they were eaten in substantial variety and quantity because they were cheap and filling, and what you grew in the garden, or what the canning company preserved in the summer when the price was right. And they were real. The variety of vegetables that appeared regularly on 1950s tables is something food historians have documented carefully. Beets, fresh or canned, served pickled or roasted or in borscht. Turnips and parsnips and rutabagas, the root vegetables that have almost entirely vanished from mainstream American cooking, which are remarkably rich in fiber, vitamins, and the specific kinds of prebiotic compounds that feed beneficial gut bacteria. Collard greens and mustard greens and turnip tops in the South, cooked low and slow with a bit of pork for flavoring, providing levels of vitamins K and A and calcium that surpass almost any other vegetable category. Cabbage in everything, fried and braised and stuffed and made into slaw and sauerkraut, undervalued and unglamorous, and one of the most nutritionally complete vegetables in the entire food supply. Canned tomatoes and tomato juice, which because of the way the canning process works, actually makes the lycopene in tomatoes more bioavailable than it is in raw tomatoes. The cooking method, which modern nutritional fashion often dismisses as destroying nutrients, is more nuanced in its effects than a simple more cooking means-less nutrition model would suggest. Some nutrients are indeed reduced or destroyed by heat, but others become more accessible to the body when cell walls are broken down by cooking. Cooked carrots provide more bioavailable beta-carotene than raw ones. Cooked tomatoes provide more bioavailable lycopene. Cooked leafy greens are more easily eaten in volume because their bulk reduces dramatically, allowing a woman to eat the nutritional equivalent of a very large salad bowl of raw spinach in a few spoonfuls of the cooked version. The 1950s woman was not eating raw vegetables as a primary dietary strategy. Raw vegetable salads were certainly present in the diet, and the iceberg lettuce salad with Thousand Island dressing was a genuine staple of the era. But the primary vegetable consumption was cooked, and in that form was providing substantial amounts of minerals and vitamins that cook out of highly water-soluble vegetables only when they are boiled and the water discarded, which is certainly one thing the 1950s kitchen did do, and which nutritional historians regard as a genuine loss. But the variety, the regularity, the sheer casual presence of vegetables in virtually every meal made up for whatever the boiling water took away. Let us talk about a specific vegetable that occupied a place of remarkable prominence in the 1950s diet and that has since faded from regular use so dramatically that younger people sometimes encounter it as a novelty. Let us talk about the beet. Beets were everywhere in the 1950s kitchen. Canned beets were in the pantry. Fresh beets from the garden were pickled in the summer and kept in jars through the winter. Harvard beets, a classic preparation involving beets cooked in a sweet and sour sauce of vinegar and sugar and cornstarch, appeared on restaurant menus and at holiday tables. Borscht, the deep red beet soup brought by Eastern European immigrants and fully naturalized into American cooking by mid-century, was a regular feature of many households. Cold pickled beets were a standard side dish, appearing on plates alongside roast pork or cold chicken as naturally as we might today add a green salad. Beets are nutritionally interesting for several reasons that were not known in 1953, but that retroactively explain some of the esteem in which they were held. They contain betaine, a compound that supports liver function and the metabolism of homocysteine, an amino acid that at elevated levels is associated with cardiovascular disease and inflammation. They are among the richest dietary sources of nitrates, which convert in the body to nitric oxide, a compound that dilates blood vessels, lowers blood pressure, and improves oxygen efficiency in muscle tissue. They contain significant amounts of folate, manganese, and potassium. Their deep pigmentation comes from betalains, antioxidant compounds that are relatively rare in the food supply. Women eating beets regularly were supporting their liver function, their blood pressure regulation, and their folate status without any of the nutritional vocabulary that would eventually describe those benefits. They were just eating beets because beets were what you ate, because your mother had grown them in the garden, because they were cheap and kept well and made the plate look beautiful with their deep crimson. Now let us spend some time with a food category that defined the 1950s diet in ways that have almost no parallel in contemporary food culture, a category that was so ordinary at the time that it barely registered as distinctive, but which, when you look at it carefully, was providing something that the modern diet struggles to replicate. That category is bone broth, though nobody called it that. It was just stock, just the pot of bones simmering on the back of the stove. In the 1950s, a thrifty housewife did not throw away bones, not the chicken carcass after Sunday's roast, not the beef bones from the pot roast, not the pork knuckle from the soup. These went into a pot with water and an onion and perhaps a carrot and some celery, and they simmered for hours sometimes, filling the kitchen with a smell that has no exact modern equivalent, something deep and savory and faintly mineral and completely unlike anything that comes from a can or a carton. The resulting liquid, strained and cooled, skimmed of fat, if the woman was being careful, was used as the base for soups, stews, gravies, rice, beans, anything that required liquid and would benefit from depth of flavor. A soup made from scratch with real stock had a body and a richness that the same soup made with water or canned broth did not have, and that body came from the gelatin that the bones released during their long simmer. Gelatin is denatured collagen, the structural protein that makes up the connective tissue in bones and joints. When bones are simmered in water for extended periods, the collagen breaks down and dissolves into the liquid as gelatin, giving it a slightly thick, glossy consistency that sets to a soft jelly when cooled. A quality housewives called good bone broth setting up, meaning the collagen content was high. When you ate soup made from this stock, you were consuming glycine and proline, the amino acids that form the structure of collagen and that the body uses to repair and maintain its own connective tissue. You are consuming minerals, calcium and magnesium and phosphorus that leach from the bones during the long simmer and become part of the liquid. You are supporting your gut lining because glycine is one of the primary building blocks of the mucosal layer that protects the intestinal wall. None of these mechanisms were known in 1953. What was known was that chicken soup made from the whole bird cured colds, that beef stock-based soups were restorative to the weak and the ill and the newly delivered, that a good homemade broth had a quality that the cook could feel in her joints and her skin in a way that was difficult to articulate but was somehow understood to be real. Jewish grandmothers called chicken soup Jewish penicillin and meant it only partly as a joke. The restorative quality of real bone broth was not imagination. It was biochemistry arriving at a conclusion that the folk tradition had reached through entirely different means. The shift away from homemade stock was gradual and is largely explicable through economics and time. Canned broth and bouillon cubes became widely available in the 1950s and were aggressively marketed as the modern time-saving alternative to hours of simmering. They tasted similar enough to work in most recipes. They didn't require you to save bones or have a stock pot large enough to hold a chicken carcass. As women began entering the workforce in larger numbers through the late 1950s and 1960s, the luxury of a pot simmering on the stove all afternoon became increasingly rare, and with it went the weekly or bi-weekly bone broth that had been, entirely incidentally, a significant source of glycine and minerals and gut-supportive compounds. The bones went into the garbage instead of the pot, and something small but real went with them. Let us talk about cod liver oil, because no discussion of 1950s women's health practices is complete without it, and it is one of the more striking examples of something that was absolutely correct being abandoned for reasons that had very little to do with evidence. Cod liver oil was taken by women, and especially children, throughout the first half of the 20th century as a matter of course. It was unpleasant, famously so, with a strong fishy taste and smell that no amount of flavouring could fully disguise. But it was taken because generations of mothers had been giving it to their children and to themselves for so long that its efficacy was simply assumed. The children of the 1950s who grew up taking cod liver oil did so because their parents had taken it and their grandparents before that, and because the medical community at this point in history still endorsed it. Cod liver oil is extraordinarily rich in vitamins A and D in their preformed, immediately bioavailable animal forms, and in omega-3 fatty acids, specifically EPA and DHA, the long-chain forms that the body uses directly rather than needing to convert from the shorter-chain ALA found in plant sources. The combination of these nutrients in a single supplement is something that is exceedingly difficult to replicate through any other single food or even through most combinations of foods in a typical modern diet. Vitamin D from cod liver oil is the vitamin D3 form that the body makes from sunlight and that is most efficiently used for every function that vitamin D serves, from bone mineralization to immune regulation to mood stabilization to hormonal synthesis. A woman taking a teaspoon of cod liver oil every day was in the grey months of winter when sunlight-derived vitamin D production drops to near zero at northern latitudes, maintaining vitamin D levels that had a measurable effect on her immunity, her mood, her skin, and the efficiency of her thyroid gland. Vitamin A in the retinol form provided by cod liver oil is the form that is directly used by the skin for cell turnover, by the immune system for mucosal defense, by the eyes for low-light vision, and by the reproductive system for proper hormonal function. The clear skin and good vision that many women of the 1950s are photographically documented as having were not entirely the result of genetic fortune. They were the result, in part, of years of fat-soluble vitamin intake through egg yolks and butter and liver and cod liver oil that kept these systems well supplied. The omega-3 fatty acids are a separate story entirely. EPA and DHA are the building blocks of cell membranes throughout the body, most critically in the brain and the retina of the eye. They are strongly anti-inflammatory, reducing the systemic low-grade inflammation that underlies many chronic diseases and that is also associated with weight gain and metabolic dysfunction. They support cardiovascular health, joint health, and skin health in ways that have been extensively documented in research conducted largely in the decades after cod liver oil quietly disappeared from most medicine cabinets. A woman taking cod liver oil every day was significantly reducing her inflammatory burden without knowing that is what she was doing, simply by following a practice that had been handed down from grandmother to mother to daughter without explanation. What killed cod liver oil's cultural standing was a combination of things: the post-war food industry's increasing sophistication in marketing processed foods created a cultural atmosphere in which the old-fashioned, grandmother-administered, unpleasant-tasting traditional remedy began to feel backward and unnecessary. The rise of the multivitamin in the 1950s offered the appeal of getting all your vitamins in a pleasant, small, flavorless pill rather than a spoonful of something that smelled like the ocean floor. And then, as the campaign against dietary fat gained momentum through the late 1950s and especially the 1960s, cod liver oil, being almost entirely fat, acquired an uncomfortable association with exactly the thing that the prevailing medical narrative was beginning to tell people to avoid. By the early 1970s, cod liver oil had largely vanished from the daily habits of American women. The vitamins it had been providing were now to be obtained through processed foods fortified with synthetic versions, through the occasional multivitamin, through the diet that was now being actively shaped by nutritional guidelines that had turned fat into the enemy and grains into the foundation. The results of this shift would take decades to fully manifest, but manifest they did in exactly the ways that the absence of the nutrients cod liver oil had been providing would predict. Let us now talk about a category of food that was central to the 1950s diet in ways that are often forgotten in retrospect, in part because the form in which it was eaten has changed so dramatically that the modern version barely resembles the original. Let us talk about dairy. Dairy in the 1950s was whole dairy. This requires emphasis because the word dairy no longer implies whole dairy in contemporary usage. When a 1950s woman drank a glass of milk, she drank whole milk, the kind with the cream floating on top that you had to shake or pour carefully to distribute before drinking. When she used cheese, she used real cheese, the kind made from whole milk by traditional methods, not the processed American cheese product that was also appearing on grocery shelves in this era, and that shared a name and a surface resemblance with real cheese while being nutritionally quite different. When she used cream, she used real cream. When she made yogurt, those who made yogurt at all were making it from whole milk in a plain lightly fermented form with no added sugar. The fat in whole dairy products is a specific kind of fat that deserves its own discussion. Dairy fat contains a compound called conjugated linoleic acid, or CLA, that has been studied extensively for its effects on body composition. CLA is found primarily in the fat of grass-fed ruminant animals, in their meat and especially in their dairy, and it has been shown in multiple studies to reduce body fat percentage, particularly abdominal fat, and to preserve lean muscle mass. The cows producing milk in the 1950s were not all grass-fed by any modern organic standard, but neither were they the confined, grain-finished, hormone-supplemented animals of contemporary large-scale dairy production. They were raised in conditions where pasture access was normal and grain feeding was supplemental rather than primary, which meant their milk had a CLA content that is significantly higher than the milk most people drink today. In addition to CLA, whole dairy fat contains vitamin K2, a form of vitamin K that is distinct from the K1 found in leafy greens and that serves entirely different functions in the body. Vitamin K2 is responsible for directing calcium to the bones and teeth rather than allowing it to deposit in soft tissues and blood vessels. It is found primarily in fermented dairy products and in the fat of grass-fed animals, and its role in preventing the kind of arterial calcification associated with cardiovascular disease is a subject of considerable current research. The women of the 1950s drinking whole milk from cows with some pasture access and eating aged cheese and butter from similar sources were getting meaningful amounts of K2 that have become considerably harder to obtain in the modern food supply, particularly after the low-fat dairy movement replaced whole-fat products with skimmed versions in which the fat-soluble vitamins, including K2, are dramatically reduced or absent. Whole milk also contains more iodine than skimmed milk, more magnesium, more zinc, and of course the fat that allows the fat-soluble vitamins present in milk to actually be absorbed. Drinking skimmed milk to get the calcium while avoiding the fat is a nutritional strategy that in retrospect is somewhat self-defeating. The calcium is there, but the cofactors that support its absorption and direct its utilization are substantially reduced. The women of the 1950s drinking their glasses of cold whole milk were not making a health-conscious choice in any deliberate sense. They were just drinking milk, the way people had drunk milk for thousands of years, in the form in which it naturally existed, and their bodies were benefiting from exactly that. Let me take a moment to talk about sugar, because the sugar story is perhaps the most dramatic single chapter in the nutritional history of post-war America, and understanding it is essential to understanding why the 1950s diet worked the way it did, and why the diet that replaced it did not. The average American in 1950 consumed roughly 90 pounds of sugar per year. That sounds like a great deal, and it is a great deal by almost any traditional standard, but compare it to what came later. By 1970, the figure had risen to approximately 120 pounds. By 2000, estimates ranged as high as £155 per person per year, and that figure does not include high-fructose corn syrup, which had barely existed in 1950 but had by the late 1990s become perhaps the primary sweetener in the American food supply. The sugar that the 1950s woman was consuming was real white cane sugar used in baking, in preserving, in occasional desserts, in the cup of tea or coffee that punctuated her day. It was not hidden in her tomato sauce, or her salad dressing, or her bread, or her flavored yogurt, or her fruit juice, or her infant formula, or the tens of thousands of processed food products that would eventually add sugar to things that traditionally contained none. It was in the dessert, which was eaten occasionally and in modest portions, and in the condiments and preserves and pickles that called for a measured amount of sweetness to balance their other flavors. This is the critical distinction. The sugar was visible, measurable, and consciously chosen. When the 1950s woman made a cake, she put 2 cups of sugar into it and knew that sugar was in the cake and ate a modest slice of the cake and was done. When the woman of a later decade opened a can of soup or a jar of pasta sauce or a tub of yogurt, she often did not know that added sugar was in it at all, because it was listed among 17 other ingredients in a font designed to be unreadable, and her sense of herself as a person who was not eating very much sugar was entirely unaffected by the additional teaspoon and a half of high-fructose corn syrup that had just gone into her body with the soup she bought because it said low fat on the label. The difference between visible sugar and hidden sugar is not merely philosophical. Psychologically, knowing that you are eating something sweet allows the brain to account for it in its ongoing assessment of fullness and satisfaction. The body anticipates sweetness, processes it, and registers the intake. Hidden sugar bypasses this accounting. You ate nothing sweet, your sense of yourself tells you, because you didn't eat anything that tasted dramatically sweet. But your liver, receiving a constant low-level flow of fructose from a dozen different processed food sources across the course of the day, is doing the calculations differently. The 1950s woman eating a slice of real homemade cake at a birthday party was having cake. The woman 20 years later eating a bowl of commercial breakfast cereal with flavored low-fat yogurt and a glass of orange juice was having breakfast, and neither of them was aware of how dramatically different the actual sugar content of those 2 meals was in favor of the cake. The role of excess sugar, and particularly excess fructose, in promoting fat storage, specifically around the abdomen and viscera, is now well documented in metabolic research. Fructose is metabolized almost exclusively in the liver, and when it arrives there in quantities exceeding the liver's capacity to use it for energy, it is converted to fat. This fat accumulates first in the liver, producing the condition now called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and then travels outward to storage sites, preferentially the abdominal area. The slim waistlines of 1950s women were not maintained by willpower or physical labor alone, though both of those contributed. They were maintained in part by the absence from the diet of the relentless hidden fructose load that would arrive in the food supply over the following decades. Now let us follow the day a little further. Let us move past the morning and the noon plate and into the mid-afternoon, which was its own distinct nutritional moment in the 1950s household. In many households, the mid-afternoon break was a cup of tea or coffee, and sometimes, not always, a small something alongside it. What that small something was is illuminating. Not a commercial snack bar, not a bag of chips, not a sweetened drink, a piece of fresh fruit, a small number of plain crackers, a handful of walnuts or peanuts from a dish on the counter, a slice of cheese. These were not the result of deliberate portion-controlled snacking strategy. They were simply what was available and what seemed appropriate for a moment that was not a full meal. Small, real, containing protein or fat or fiber or some combination of all three, and stopping naturally because there was not more of them sitting around. The concept of the snack as a commercial product category did not yet exist in any serious way in the early 1950s. Fritos corn chips had been introduced in 1932 and were present on the market, and Lay's potato chips were becoming widely distributed. But the snack food industry as we understand it, the full wall of an entire section of the grocery store, devoted to hundreds of individual flavors and formats of chips and crackers and popcorn and pretzels and cheese puffs and cookies and candy bars, all engineered to be hyper-palatable and consumed in quantities well beyond what any single moment of actual hunger would justify, that was still in the future. The 1950s grocery store had a snack food section, but it was small, and the products in it were simpler, and the volume of purchase was modest compared to what came later. Between the mid-afternoon cup of tea and the evening dinner, there was no second snack, no dinner-adjacent appetizer, no pre-dinner bowl of something. The kitchen was being prepared for dinner, not providing a running stream of additional food between meals. This enforced pause between eating occasions, which modern nutrition researchers discuss under the somewhat clinical term time-restricted eating, was simply the natural rhythm of the household in this era. You ate at mealtimes, you didn't eat constantly between them, and the metabolic effect of those pauses, allowing insulin levels to fall, allowing the body to access stored fat for energy during the intervals, was real, though none of the women managing those kitchen schedules would have described it in those terms. Now let us come to dinner, which in the 1950s household was typically the most elaborate and carefully prepared meal of the day. Not elaborate in the modern Instagram-worthy sense, but elaborate in the sense of requiring genuine preparation and skill and time, the kind of dinner that had been simmering or roasting for several hours before the family sat down to it. The pot roast belongs to this part of the story. The pot roast, braised slowly in a Dutch oven in the oven for 3 or 4 hours with carrots and potatoes and onions and a little stock and perhaps a small amount of tomato paste, was one of the signature dishes of the 1950s American kitchen, and it was nutritionally extraordinary in ways that are easy to overlook. A chuck roast, the cut that was traditionally used for pot roast, contained significant amounts of connective tissue, the silky ribbons of collagen that surround the muscle fibers and that break down during the long, moist braise into the gelatin that gives the braising liquid its richness and the meat its characteristic tender, almost falling apart texture. This process, low heat over a long time in the presence of moisture, is one of the most complete ways to extract nutritional value from a piece of meat. The collagen becomes gelatin, providing the same glycine and proline that bone broth provides. The fat that renders out of the meat during cooking provides the fat-soluble vitamins and the fatty acids that are present in all animal fats to some degree. The vegetables cooked in the braising liquid absorb some of the fat and fat-soluble nutrients from the meat, while contributing their own vitamins and minerals to the communal pot liquid, which was then served as a sauce or gravy, concentrating the nutrients into the meal rather than discarding them. The woman who made pot roast every week without thinking particularly about what she was doing was conducting a nutrient extraction process that any nutritional biochemist would recognize as sound. She had learnt it from her mother, who had learnt it from hers, and the knowledge had been refined over generations toward the method that produced the richest, most satisfying result, which happened also to be the method that produced the most nutritionally complete dish. After the pot roast came to the table, the remaining braising liquid, any leftover vegetables, the bones from the short ribs or the neck bones if those cuts had been used, all of this went into the stock pot for the next day's soup. Nothing was wasted, everything was extracted to its last use. The kitchen operated according to a logic of complete utilization that had been developed over centuries of limited resources and that happened, as a happy consequence, to produce food that was more nutritionally dense than the same meal made from more expensive, more convenient, less thoroughly used ingredients. I want to spend some time with bread now, because bread in the 1950s is genuinely complicated and deserves careful attention rather than simple romanticism. Bread was present on the 1950s table. White bread, specifically, was the dominant form, and it had been since the mid-19th century, when milling technology advanced far enough to produce the refined white flour that earlier generations had eaten only on special occasions. By the 1950s, commercially produced white bread, the soft, even-textured, preservative-stabilized loaf wrapped in waxed paper, had been the American standard for decades. Wonder Bread, introduced in 1921, was already an institution. It was soft, it was consistent, it was inexpensive, and it was beginning in this era to be fortified with B vitamins and iron to replace some of what the refining process had removed. This is not the bread of romanticized nutritional nostalgia. White bread made from refined flour, with the germ and bran removed, is a relatively low-nutrient food that raises blood sugar quickly and provides little in the way of the fiber, vitamins, and minerals that whole-grain bread contains. The 1950s kitchen was not using artisan whole-grain sourdough as its daily bread. It was using Wonder Bread, or a close equivalent, and the nutritional consequences of that were real. The woman who walked out to her garden in the morning to pick green beans for dinner, or who had cucumbers from her vines in the refrigerator that were no more than a day or two old, was eating a quality of vegetable that the modern woman buying the same vegetable from the supermarket several days after it was picked, and several days after that vegetable was harvested, is not getting, not through any fault of the supermarket or the modern food supply, but simply through the physics of distance and time and nutrient degradation. Beyond the nutritional quality of the individual vegetables, the kitchen garden contributed to the household diet an abundance and variety that was not available in any other form at anything approaching the same cost. A row of tomatoes in August was a nearly inexhaustible supply of fresh food that could be eaten as is, preserved in jars, made into sauce, cooked into everything. The summer abundance of the kitchen garden was the raw material for the winter pantry, the shelves of home-canned tomatoes and green beans and corn and beets that would carry the household through the cold months in a way that required no trips to a store and no money that was not already spent in the initial outset of seed and labor. And the labor of the garden, like the labor of the kitchen, was physical in ways that contributed to the daily activity total, a pleasant physical work done in sunlight, which itself carried the benefit of vitamin D synthesis that was integrated into the daily life of the woman managing it without being understood as exercise. Now let us move forward in the day to a moment that I think is particularly revealing. Let us talk about the 1950s woman's relationship with dessert, because it is quite different from what the culture of the era is sometimes assumed to have been. Dessert in the 1950s was eaten, real dessert, containing real sugar and real butter and real cream, was made and served and enjoyed. This is not a diet culture that avoided sweets. Homemade pie, layer cake, pudding, cobbler, cookies, all of these were present in the kitchen and on the table and were consumed without particular guilt or elaborate self-negotiation. The difference from the present is not in the presence of dessert, but in the quantity, the frequency, and above all the quality. Homemade desserts made with real butter, whole eggs, and real sugar are calorie-dense, satisfying, and consumed in modest portions because they are rich enough that modest portions are genuinely satisfying. A slice of a good homemade pie, made with a butter crust and a filling of real fruit sweetened with a measured amount of sugar, is a complete experience. It registers in the body as such. The fat and the protein from the eggs and the butter and the creamy filling slow the absorption of the sugar and extend the satiety of the dessert through a metabolic mechanism that the body recognizes and responds to. Commercial desserts, highly processed desserts made with vegetable shortenings and corn syrups and artificial flavors, are engineered in ways that work against these natural satiety signals. They are lighter and airier, which makes it easier to eat more of them without the physical sensation of fullness. They are sweet and salty and fatty in combinations calibrated to keep the reward signal in the brain firing past the point at which natural fullness would normally stop eating. They are designed to be hyper-palatable in ways that homemade food made with simple real ingredients is not, because no grandmother calibrating a recipe for flavor and economy and the pleasure of her family was also engineering it for maximum overconsumption. The 1950s woman eating a slice of her own homemade pie was engaging with a dessert that had natural endpoints built into it by virtue of its richness and its authenticity. The modern person eating commercial baked goods or ice cream or candy is engaging with a product that has been designed by food scientists whose literal professional goal is to eliminate or postpone those natural endpoints. These are not the same thing with different packaging. They are fundamentally different interventions in the body's relationship with food. There is a phrase that food scientists use for the quality of commercial junk food that makes it so difficult to stop eating: hyperpalatable. It means engineered to be more palatable than any natural food, to hit more pleasure receptors more strongly than any combination of whole ingredients could naturally achieve. The desserts of the 1950s home kitchen, made from butter and eggs and flour and real fruit and sugar, were palatable. They were delicious, they were loved and anticipated and savored, but they were not hyperpalatable. They did not override the body's fullness signals, and so they were eaten in the amounts that a body naturally eats something delicious and filling, and then stopped. Let me now draw these threads together into something more unified, because I have been circling around a central point that I want to state clearly before we go further. What the 1950s woman ate, taken as a whole pattern rather than as a collection of individual foods, was a diet characterized by a few core principles that nutritional science, a field that barely existed in its modern form in the 1950s, has since spent decades validating through research. Protein at every meal, providing satiety, metabolic support, and lean mass preservation. Adequate dietary fat from animal sources, providing fat-soluble vitamins, hormonal building blocks, and the slow-burning energy that keeps blood sugar stable. Real, minimally processed foods as the overwhelming majority of what was eaten, providing the full complement of cofactors and micronutrients that the body needs and that refining and processing consistently destroy or remove. Fermented foods as a daily presence, maintaining gut microbiome diversity and the digestive health that underlies virtually every other dimension of metabolic function. Limited refined carbohydrates, not as an explicit dietary strategy, but as a natural consequence of eating primarily from whole food sources. Fixed meal times with genuine gaps between them, allowing the insulin rhythms that support fat metabolism to operate as they should. Moderate total food quantity, not through deprivation, but through the natural satiety that comes from a diet composed primarily of protein and fat and real food. And physical movement woven into the daily routine of household management, providing the activity that the diet was fueling and that the body needed. None of this was called a diet, none of it had a name. It was simply how one ate, how one's mother had eaten, how the household had always functioned. The wisdom was not self-conscious. It had simply accumulated over generations of people figuring out through observation and practice what made them feel good, what kept them strong, what their bodies needed, and it worked. By any metric that the 1950s would have used to measure it, the women who ate this way were lean, energetic, clear-skinned, long-lived by the standards of the era, and free from many of the chronic metabolic diseases that would become epidemic in the following generations. Let us now move toward a somewhat darker part of the story, because the 1950s was not nutritional utopia, and there were aspects of the food culture that were genuinely problematic and that should be acknowledged before we move on. The first is that the 1950s saw the early and rapid expansion of processed food in the American diet, and not all of the processed foods arriving on grocery shelves in this era were benign. Margarine, made from partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, was aggressively marketed as a healthier, more modern alternative to butter, and it was increasingly chosen by women who were responding to both the economic incentive of its lower price and the early messages from some quarters of the public health world suggesting that animal fats were problematic. The partially hydrogenated vegetable oils in margarine contain trans fats, the industrial form of fat that has since been definitively linked to cardiovascular disease and that was ultimately banned from the American food supply in 2018. The women switching from butter to margarine in the 1950s and 1960s were, without knowing it, replacing a real food that had been part of the human diet for thousands of years with an industrial product containing a novel molecular form of fat that the human body had no evolutionary experience of processing. The second is the canned food question, which is more nuanced than it might appear. The reliance on canned vegetables as a significant portion of vegetable intake was not ideal. Canning involves heat processing that destroys significant amounts of heat-sensitive vitamins, particularly vitamin C and the B vitamins. A canned green bean provides some nutrition, but it is nutritionally inferior to a fresh green bean, and somewhat inferior even to a properly handled frozen one. The salt content of canned vegetables, used as a preservative and flavor enhancer, was also significant, and the early canning industry did not yet have the understanding of BPA and other plasticizer leaching from can linings that would later become a concern. Canned food was practical, economical, and provided genuine nutrition compared to no vegetables at all, but it was not the nutritional equivalent of fresh. The third concern, and this is one that is easy to underestimate, is the social and economic inequality embedded in who actually ate this way. The version of the 1950s diet that produced the outcomes we have been discussing was primarily the diet of the white middle class. Working class families, particularly in urban areas, did not always have access to the variety and quality of food that the suburban housewife had. Families living in the early versions of what would later be recognized as food deserts, communities underserved by grocery stores and over-reliant on corner stores and fast food even in its early forms, were not necessarily eating the pot roast and homegrown tomatoes and whole milk that we have been describing. The American diet of the 1950s was not uniformly excellent. It was stratified along economic and racial lines in ways that this kind of nostalgic food history can too easily gloss over. With those caveats in place, let us continue exploring what the food culture got right, because the things it got right are genuinely instructive and the lessons are applicable in ways that transcend the era. Let us talk about the American tradition of the church potluck and the community food culture that surrounded it, because this is a dimension of 1950s eating that is easy to overlook, but that played a genuine role in the nutritional landscape of the era. The church supper, the neighborhood potluck, the community gathering where every household contributed a dish and everyone ate from the common table, was a cultural institution in the 1950s that served several functions simultaneously. It was a social event. It was a form of community bonding and mutual support, and it was a nutritional education of a kind, because sitting down to a table covered with dishes that other women in your community had made from their own kitchens, their own traditions, their own grandmother's recipes, exposed you to a range of foods and preparations that you might not otherwise encounter. The foods brought to a 1950s church potluck were real. They were made at home. They were made from scratch because that is what women knew how to do, because convenience food in the forms that would later make scratch cooking optional had not yet penetrated deeply enough into the culture to make it the default. The woman who brought the scalloped potatoes had peeled and sliced real potatoes and made a real cream sauce. The woman who brought the roast chicken had roasted a real chicken. The woman who brought the apple cake had peeled and sliced real apples and made real pastry. The communal table was a table of real food in a way that a contemporary potluck, where the dishes are more likely to be assembled from commercial components or contributed in store-bought form, often is not. This is not a moral criticism of the modern potluck. It is an observation about the nutritional character of food culture at different moments in time. A table of scratch-made food from multiple households represents a range of whole food ingredients prepared by hand, and the person eating from it is getting nutrition from food in the form closest to how it existed in nature, in all its complexity and variety. There is something real and valuable in that. Now let us talk about sleep and its relationship to food and body composition, because this is an element of the 1950s daily routine that had nutritional consequences that are not often discussed in this context. The 1950s woman generally went to sleep earlier and woke earlier than her counterpart today. Television, which was arriving in American homes during these years, was programmed to end early. Test patterns and sign-offs were standard at around 11 or midnight on most stations. The absence of 24-hour programming, of streaming services and smartphones, and the constant availability of stimulating screen content meant that the natural pressure toward earlier bedtimes was not being worked against by the same forces that push contemporary sleep schedules later and later. The typical household in the early to mid-1950s was dark by 10 or 10:30, and the woman in it had usually been asleep by that time. Sleep and body weight regulation are connected through mechanisms that are now well studied. Growth hormone, one of the primary hormones involved in fat metabolism and muscle repair and lean mass maintenance, is secreted primarily during the deep stages of sleep, particularly the first several hours of the night. A woman consistently getting 7 or 8 hours of sleep starting by 10 or 10:30 was maximizing her growth hormone secretion and the fat metabolizing, muscle-preserving work it does. Cortisol, the stress hormone that promotes fat storage especially around the abdomen when chronically elevated, follows a diurnal rhythm that depends on regular sleep patterns. Sufficient, regular sleep keeps cortisol in its appropriate rhythm. Sleep deprivation disrupts that rhythm and is now recognized as a significant driver of weight gain, independent of caloric intake, through its effects on cortisol, insulin sensitivity, and the appetite hormones leptin and ghrelin. The 1950s woman sleeping regular hours in a household that was dark and quiet at 10 was not making a sleep health intervention. She was simply living in a world that had not yet developed a technology to make sleep deprivation easy and rewarding. But the metabolic consequences of that regular, adequate sleep were real, and they were one of the invisible background factors that supported the body composition she maintained without particularly trying. There is also the matter of morning light and its effect on the circadian rhythm, which I mention only briefly because it relates to the daily activity pattern we discussed earlier. A woman who was outdoors in her garden, or hanging laundry, or walking to the store in the morning hours, was exposing herself to the natural morning light that synchronizes the circadian clock, maintains appropriate daytime cortisol rhythm, and supports the quality of nighttime sleep. A woman who spends her mornings inside under artificial light before driving in a car to a workplace and spending her day in an artificially lit environment does not get this benefit, and the disruption to circadian rhythm and sleep quality that follows has metabolic consequences that add to the complexity of body weight management in contemporary life. None of this is about nostalgia. None of this is about wanting to return to a time when women had fewer choices and narrower lives. It is about recognizing that the biological systems that regulate body composition and metabolic health were operating in an environment in the 1950s that supported their natural function in ways that the current environment does not, for reasons that have nothing to do with individual moral failing and everything to do with the design of the world around us. Let us return to the kitchen and talk about a category of 1950s food that I have not yet discussed and that deserves its own careful attention. Let us talk about fish. Fish was eaten in the 1950s American household with a regularity and a simplicity that has since been largely lost, not because fish was more popular or more beloved than it is now, but because it was inexpensive and available, because the Catholic households that were a significant portion of the American population in this era observed Friday abstinence from meat and turned to fish as a matter of religious practice, and because the broader culture had not yet developed the aversion to plain, simple cooked fish that would arise later as the food became associated in the popular imagination, primarily with the smell of school cafeteria tuna casserole. Canned tuna was the most ubiquitous fish in the 1950s kitchen, eaten in tuna noodle casserole, in tuna salad sandwiches, in tuna melts at diners, in tuna salad served on a plate of lettuce with crackers, and perhaps a canned peach half in the reducing plate tradition. The tuna noodle casserole, a dish that has become a symbol of mid-century culinary uncoolness, was nutritionally more interesting than its reputation suggests. Canned tuna is an excellent source of protein, selenium, B vitamins, and omega-3 fatty acids. Egg noodles provided carbohydrates and some protein. The cream of mushroom soup that was used as the binder, while being a processed commercial product, contained some protein and fat, and the characteristic flavor that made the dish what it was. As a weekly dinner for a family on a moderate budget, it was not a nutritional catastrophe. It was a reasonable and genuinely satisfying use of inexpensive ingredients. Fresh fish, where it was available and affordable, was typically prepared simply, broiled or baked with butter and a squeeze of lemon, pan-fried in a small amount of fat, made into chowder with whole milk and potatoes and onions. The New England tradition of combining the flavors of the sea with the heartiness of dairy and starch in a way that has been feeding cold-weather people for 3 centuries. Fish chowder, made properly with whole milk and butter and fresh fish and well-cooked potatoes and a good amount of salt, is a nutritionally complete meal that provides protein from the fish, fat-soluble vitamins from the butter and the fatty fish, carbohydrates from the potatoes, and the bone-building minerals of milk, all in a form that is deeply warming and satisfying, and that takes maybe 30 minutes to make from scratch. The fatty fish that appeared occasionally on the 1950s table, sardines from a can eaten on crackers, mackerel baked in the oven, salmon from a can, or occasionally fresh, herring pickled in sour cream. All of these were sources of the EPA and DHA omega-3 fatty acids that the research of subsequent decades would identify as some of the most important nutrients in the human diet for cardiovascular health, inflammatory balance, brain function, and hormonal health. The women eating pickled herring from a jar in the refrigerator, or opening a can of sardines for a quick lunch were not making a sophisticated nutritional choice. They were eating what was available and inexpensive and what they happened to like, but they were getting something from it that the low-fat diet revolution would make considerably harder to get once the fatty, oily fish became victims of the same anti-fat sentiment that removed egg yolks and butter from the approved menu. Now let me talk about something that existed in 1950s food culture as a strong undercurrent, not quite mainstream, not quite alternative, but present and influential in ways that deserve recognition. Let me talk about the Adele Davis phenomenon. Adele Davis was a nutritionist and best-selling author whose books, beginning with Let's Cook It Right in 1947 and continuing through Let's Have Healthy Children, Let's Eat Right to Keep Fit, and Let's Get Well, made her the most widely read nutrition writer in America through the 1950s and into the 1960s. Her books were on the nightstands and in the kitchen bookshelves of millions of American women, and what she said, while sometimes controversially stated and in some cases factually imprecise, pointed clearly toward principles that mainstream nutritional science would not arrive at for decades. Davis argued for whole foods over processed ones at a time when the food industry was marketing processed foods as the modern, scientific, healthful choice. She argued for the nutritional importance of animal proteins and fats at a time when the campaign against dietary fat was beginning to build. She argued for raw milk and organ meats and egg yolks and liver at a time when these foods were beginning to acquire the negative associations that would eventually drive them from many tables. She argued for the critical importance of vitamins and minerals obtained from real food rather than from synthetic supplements, and for the role of nutritional deficiency in a range of common health conditions that the medical establishment of the era was treating with pharmaceuticals rather than diet. Her influence on the women who read her, and there were millions of them, was toward a dietary practice that in retrospect looks considerably more sound than the official nutritional guidelines that would eventually replace it in the public consciousness. A woman who read Let's Eat Right to Keep Fit in 1954 and took its advice was probably eating more liver and more eggs and more dairy and fewer refined foods than she would have otherwise, and was probably healthier for it. Davis was imperfect. Some of her specific claims were not well supported even by the evidence available at the time, and some of her recommended supplement doses were harmfully high in a small number of cases. But the broad direction of her dietary advice, real food, animal proteins and fats, whole eggs, organ meats, limited processing, adequate vitamins obtained from food, was pointing toward the same principles that the metabolic research of the following half-century would gradually validate. She represents in the 1950s food landscape a thread of nutritional intelligence running beneath the surface of the mainstream culture, available to women who sought it out, reinforcing the habits that had been passed down from mothers and grandmothers and beginning to build the vocabulary that would eventually allow those habits to be explained in scientific terms rather than merely transmitted through tradition. Now let us move toward the part of this story that represents a genuine turning point, the period in the late 1950s and early 1960s when the food culture began to change in ways that would accumulate over the following decades into something dramatically different from what we have been describing. The catalyst was several things at once. The general prosperity of the post-war period was putting more discretionary income into American households and creating a market for convenience in a way that wartime austerity had not allowed. Women were entering the paid workforce in increasing numbers, reducing the hours available for scratch cooking, and creating genuine demand for the time-saving products that the food industry was eager to supply. The television set, now in the majority of American homes, was the most powerful advertising medium ever developed, and the food industry was using it with extraordinary effectiveness to reshape food culture in the direction of its own products. And then there was the fat hypothesis. In 1953, a nutritional epidemiologist named Ansel Keys published what would become one of the most influential and most controversial studies in the history of nutrition science. Looking at data from several countries, he proposed that dietary saturated fat was the primary driver of heart disease, the leading cause of death in the United States, through its effect on blood cholesterol levels. The hypothesis was elegantly simple and terrifying in its implications, and it arrived at a moment when heart disease was genuinely alarming large numbers of Americans who had watched fathers and husbands die of heart attacks at relatively young ages. Keyes pursued his hypothesis with singular determination for the next several decades, becoming perhaps the most powerful individual influence on American nutritional policy in the 20th century. By the late 1950s and through the 1960s, his ideas were beginning to filter into the mainstream, into medical advice, into women's magazine recommendations, into the early stirrings of what would eventually become official dietary guidelines. The message was clear and simple. Saturated fat raises cholesterol. Cholesterol causes heart disease. Therefore, eat less saturated fat. This meant less butter, less whole milk, less red meat, fewer eggs. Replace them with vegetable oils, margarine, lean protein, and reduced fat dairy. The women who began following this advice were, in most cases, genuinely trying to be healthy, genuinely trying to protect themselves and their families from the cardiovascular disease that had claimed so many men of their generation. The advice was coming from credentialed sources, from their doctors, from the American Heart Association, from the first nutritional guidelines. It seemed evidence-based. It seemed modern. It seemed like the kind of thing that an intelligent, informed woman in 1965 would do. What they were doing, without knowing it, was removing from their diets the foods that had been providing fat-soluble vitamins, hormonal building blocks, CLA, vitamin K2, long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, complete proteins in the most bioavailable forms, adequate choline, and the natural satiety signals that had kept them from overeating. And they were replacing those foods with refined vegetable oils containing omega-6 fatty acids in ratios to omega-3s that the human body had not evolved to handle, with margarine containing trans fats, with reduced fat dairy that provided neither the fat-soluble vitamins of whole dairy, nor the CLA, nor the K2, with egg white products that provided the protein without the vitamins, with lean protein sources that satisfied macronutrient goals without providing the full nutritional matrix that whole food animal proteins contain. The health outcomes of this collective nutritional shift did not vindicate it. The decades following the widespread adoption of low-fat dietary guidelines saw heart disease rates continue at the levels that had prompted the intervention, saw the obesity epidemic begin, saw the rates of type 2 diabetes increase dramatically, saw the rise of the metabolic syndrome as a prevalent diagnosis rather than an unusual one. The fat hypothesis, as it was originally formulated, did not prove out. The relationship between dietary saturated fat, blood cholesterol, and cardiovascular disease is significantly more complex than the simple linear model that Anshel Keys proposed, and the research of subsequent decades has substantially revised and qualified the original conclusions. But the dietary pattern that the hypothesis produced, the low-fat, high-carbohydrate dietary template that became official American nutritional policy from the late 1970s through the early 2000s, had already been embedded in food culture in ways that were very difficult to undo. The women of the 1950s who ate eggs and butter and liver and pot roast and drank whole milk without guilt were, in retrospect, eating a diet that served their bodies well. The women of the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s who replaced those foods with the low-fat alternatives recommended by official guidelines were, in many cases, eating a diet that served their bodies less well, that made weight management harder through the removal of the satiety-providing fats and proteins and their replacement with refined carbohydrates, that reduced their intake of critical fat-soluble nutrients, and that introduced novel industrial compounds into the food supply in quantities that the human body had not evolved to manage. This is not a simple story of one era being right and another being wrong. Nutrition is complex, individual responses to dietary patterns vary enormously, and the 1950s had its own nutritional problems and inequities that should not be glossed over. But the broad arc of the story is one of a dietary tradition that worked, that had been refined over generations toward the forms that best served human health, being replaced by something that sounded more scientific and modern, but that was in important respects significantly less sound. Let us now spend some time with a specific kind of cooking that characterized the 1950s kitchen and that has largely been lost, not because it was replaced by something better, but because it was replaced by something faster. Let us talk about the long, slow cooking methods that defined so much of what was nutritionally distinctive about the era. The long braised pot roast we have already discussed, but there were others. Dried beans, soaked overnight and then cooked for several hours in a pot with an onion and a piece of smoked pork until they were soft and creamy and deeply flavored, were a regular feature of the 1950s table in a way that has since declined sharply as canned beans became the universal substitute. The difference between a properly cooked pot of dried beans and a can of commercial beans is not merely textural. Dried beans cooked from scratch have been soaked and rinsed, reducing the anti-nutrient compounds that in large quantities interfere with mineral absorption. They have been cooked at a temperature and for a time that breaks down starches in a way that the canning process, which uses higher heat for shorter periods, does not fully replicate, and they have been allowed to develop their flavor through a long, slow process that cannot be hurried without losing something, a depth and richness that makes the pot of beans a genuinely satisfying meal rather than a convenient ingredient. Slow-cooked oatmeal is another example. The steel-cut oats cooked on the stovetop for 20 or 30 minutes, left to sit and absorb their liquid, developing a creamy, starchy texture that is quite different from the instant oatmeal of a later era, were a regular breakfast in many households. Steel-cut oats have a lower glycemic index than rolled or instant oats because the large, unbroken grain structure means the starch is digested more slowly, producing a more gradual rise in blood sugar and a more extended satiety. A woman eating a bowl of properly cooked steel-cut oatmeal with a small amount of butter stirred in, the fat further slowing the starch digestion, and perhaps a soft-boiled egg alongside, was eating a breakfast that would carry her to lunchtime in a way that a bowl of instant oatmeal or a commercial breakfast cereal would not. The slow-cooked foods of the 1950s kitchen required time that most contemporary kitchens do not budget, and this is a genuine constraint. You cannot make dried beans from scratch in 20 minutes, and in a household where dinner needs to be on the table at 6 and the cook is arriving home from work at 5:30, the can of beans wins every time. The food industry understood this perfectly and built its entire market proposition on this understanding. Convenience is real. Time pressure is real. The 30-minute casserole from a recipe card using canned soup and packaged ingredients solved a genuine problem. But in solving the time problem, it also quietly removed from the diet the nutritional benefits of the slow-cooked version, and it introduced the preservatives and sodium and processing additives that the canned and packaged components brought with them. The question is not whether convenience is bad. It is not. The question is what was lost in the trade, and whether the loss was necessary, or whether it is possible to recover some of what was valuable about the old approach within the constraints of contemporary life. I think the answer is that it is possible, in part, for those with the time and the interest, and that understanding what was nutritionally valuable about the old way is a prerequisite for knowing what is worth recovering. Let us now turn to the social dimension of 1950s eating, because food is never only biochemistry, and the context in which food is eaten matters to how the body processes it in ways that are sometimes surprising. The family meal in the 1950s was a social ritual with fixed participants, fixed times, and fixed roles. Everyone sat down together. The food was served in the kitchen and carried to the table or served at the table from common dishes. Conversations happened, arguments happened, laughter happened, the passing of dishes and the offering of more happened, all in a shared physical space around a shared table in a way that has become considerably less common in many households. Eating together around a table without screens, in a relatively unhurried manner, has been associated in research with a range of outcomes that are relevant to the nutritional story we have been telling. People who eat meals together at a table eat more slowly than people eating alone or while distracted, and eating more slowly gives the body time to register satiety signals from the gut and the hormonal system that lag behind the actual intake of food by approximately 20 minutes. A person eating quickly, as is more common when eating alone, in front of a screen, or while doing something else, can consume significantly more calories before those signals arrive than a person eating slowly in a social setting naturally does. Children who eat family meals together are, according to research from multiple sources, more likely to eat a wider variety of foods, less likely to have weight problems, and less likely to develop disordered eating patterns. The family meal serves as a nutritional education in the most organic possible sense, exposing children to a range of foods prepared at home, establishing eating patterns and preferences, and providing the social context in which the relationship with food is first formed. The 1950s family meal was not always pleasant. It was the setting for dynamics that were sometimes oppressive and controlled in ways that the family structures of the era enforced. We have talked about those dynamics in other contexts and they are real, but the meal itself, the fact of sitting down together with real food prepared at home in a reasonably unhurried manner, was providing a nutritional and psychological scaffolding that had genuine value. And the decline of the family meal over the following decades, as work schedules diverged, as screen time multiplied, as the kitchen became a space for reheating rather than cooking, represented a genuine loss, not only socially but nutritionally. Now I want to take a step back and look at the whole picture, because I think there is something important to say about the way the 1950s dietary pattern came to be, and why it has been difficult to recover deliberately what was preserved through habit and culture. The eating patterns of the 1950s were not chosen, they were not designed, they were not the product of any scientific consensus or nutritional philosophy. They were simply what had accumulated through generations of people eating what was available, what they could grow or afford, what their mothers had made, what the seasons provided, what the culture considered normal. The wisdom embedded in them was not self-conscious. It was implicit, transmitted through practice rather than articulation, maintained by the social structures and economic conditions of a particular moment in time. When those social structures began to change, when women entered the workforce in large numbers, when the food industry developed the technology and the marketing capacity to reshape food culture in its own image, when official nutritional guidance began pointing away from traditional foods and toward industrial alternatives, the implicit wisdom had no defense. It was not defended because it was not understood. The woman who had always eaten eggs and butter and liver because that was what one ate had no scientific vocabulary to explain why she should continue eating them against the advice of her doctor and the messages on her television. She simply stopped because the authority was on the other side and the tradition offered no argument. What we are left with is a situation in which recovering the beneficial elements of that traditional dietary pattern requires conscious effort and knowledge, has to be chosen rather than simply inherited, and is in constant tension with a food environment that is designed by enormously well-funded commercial interests to push in exactly the opposite direction. The difficulty is real, but the first step, understanding what was nutritionally valuable about the old pattern and why, is at least possible. And perhaps it is the most honest and useful thing to say about this entire story. There are specific foods from the 1950s diet that are not difficult to reintroduce and that would provide genuine nutritional benefit to anyone who did so. Eggs as the primary breakfast food rather than cereal or a packaged product. Whole milk dairy in modest amounts, from good sources where possible. Regular consumption of liver or other organ meats even in small amounts, perhaps once a week. Real fermented foods in their least processed forms, genuine sauerkraut, genuine cultured dairy, genuine fermented pickles, bone broth made from scratch or purchased in genuine form, used as the base for soups and sauces rather than commercial alternatives, fish with some regularity, including the fatty, oily fish that provide the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, regular meals at fixed times with genuine gaps between them, the use of real animal fats in cooking rather than exclusively refined vegetable oils. These are not radical interventions, they are simply a partial restoration of what was ordinary in a period not very long ago. Let us return now to the kitchen of our Tuesday morning in 1953, because I want to close this exploration where it began, with the woman at her counter, the cottage cheese and the peach half, and the cold glass of milk, and the quietly remarkable ordinariness of a dietary pattern that worked. She is finishing her lunch. She will wash the plate and glass and set them to dry on the rack beside the sink. In the afternoon she will do whatever the afternoon requires, the ironing, the garden, the walk to the corner for a few items, the preparation of dinner that has been in the oven since 2 o'clock. She is not thinking about nutrition. She is not thinking about her diet. She is thinking about whether the roast needs more water in the pan, whether the beans she put on to soak this morning are ready to cook, whether there are enough eggs to last until Friday when the milkman comes. The food she eats, the life she lives in relation to it, is unremarkable to her. It is simply Tuesday, and in its very unremarkableness it contains something that subsequent generations have found surprisingly difficult to recover, a relationship with food that is natural, intuitive, grounded in the rhythms of the body and the seasons and the household, and quietly, effectively nourishing in ways that neither she nor anyone around her would think to articulate. There is something deeply instructive in how completely she takes it for granted. Now let us move into some of the specific recipes and preparations that characterize the 1950s diet at its most beneficial, because I think the concreteness of actual dishes helps make these principles tangible rather than abstract. The deviled egg is a perfect example of how the nutritional wisdom of the era was embedded in the most ordinary party food. Hard-boiled eggs, halved, the yolks removed and mixed with a small amount of real mayonnaise, mustard, a touch of vinegar, salt, paprika on top, and returned to the whites in their distinctive shape. Deviled eggs appeared at every gathering, every potluck, every family occasion, and they were eaten with enthusiasm. As a food, they are extraordinarily nutrient-dense for their size. All the vitamins and minerals of the egg yolk, all the protein of the white, a small amount of fat from the mayonnaise, and a flavor that is genuinely satisfying in a way that few things manage with so few calories. They are filling in the protein-rich way, meaning that a plate of deviled eggs as an appetizer substantially reduces the amount eaten at the main course, in a way that a plate of bread and crackers does not. Real mayonnaise, which the deviled eggs of this era were made with, is itself an interesting food. Made from egg yolks, oil, vinegar or lemon juice, and mustard, it contains the nutritional benefits of the egg yolk, including the fat-soluble vitamins, and the lecithin, a fat-emulsifying compound that supports liver health and brain function. Commercial mayonnaise of the era, Hellmann's and Duke's, being the primary brands, and still largely made to the same basic recipe, used predominantly soybean oil, which is higher in omega-6 fatty acids than is ideal, but which is considerably less problematic than the industrial seed oils that would later dominate. A teaspoon or two of real mayonnaise as a binding agent and flavor vehicle in egg salad or deviled eggs or cold chicken salad is a small but genuine contribution to the nutritional density of those dishes. The Jell-O salad, which is the food most associated with 1950s cooking in the popular imagination and most frequently used as evidence of the culinary unsophistication of the era, deserves a more careful look than it usually gets. Yes, the aspic-based molded salads of the period were often quite strange by modern taste standards. A lime Jell-O mold containing cream cheese and crushed pineapple, or a tomato aspic with shrimp suspended in it, would raise eyebrows at any contemporary dinner table. But Jell-O as a food base was interesting for a nutritional reason that nobody was articulating at the time. It is gelatin. Commercial Jell-O is made from gelatin derived from the collagen of animal connective tissue, with artificial flavors and colors and considerable sugar added. The sugar and the artificial additives are legitimate concerns, but the gelatin component provides the same glycine and proline that bone broth provides, the same connective tissue-supporting amino acids that the body uses for joint health and gut health and skin health. A generation of women serving their families gelatin-based desserts and salads several times a week was, without knowing it, maintaining a collective glycine intake that has since fallen sharply as gelatin products have become less central to the diet. Whether this is a significant factor in health outcomes or merely an interesting footnote is difficult to assess with precision, but the relationship between dietary glycine, gut lining health, and inflammatory status has become an increasingly active area of research. The green bean casserole, another signature dish of the era that has become a target for ironic condescension, is actually worth defending on nutritional grounds up to a point. Green beans are an excellent vegetable, providing vitamins K, C, B6 and folic acid, along with manganese and fiber. Cream of mushroom soup, while processed, contains actual mushrooms, which are one of the few non-animal sources of ergosterol that can be converted by the body to vitamin D, along with B vitamins and the prebiotic compound beta-glucan that supports immune function. French's fried onions, the topping, are fried in some form of oil, which is less than ideal, but onions themselves are a significant source of quercetin, a flavonoid with documented anti-inflammatory properties. As a whole dish, the green bean casserole is not a culinary triumph of nutrition, but neither is it the nutritional wasteland that its current reputation might suggest. It is a dish of real vegetables coated in a processed sauce and topped with a processed crunchy element, eaten occasionally at holiday meals, and as such it is essentially harmless and in some respects genuinely beneficial. Let us talk about the chicken that was Sunday dinner in so many 1950s households, because the whole roast chicken is one of the most perfect expressions of the nutritional wisdom of the era. A whole chicken roasted in the oven is a food that provides everything. The breast meat provides lean protein for those who want it. The dark meat of the thighs and legs provides protein with more fat, more iron, more zinc, more B vitamins, specifically the B vitamins that are most concentrated in the more metabolically active dark muscle. The skin, crisped golden in the oven, provides fat and flavor, and the rendered chicken fat that is itself one of the most stable and nutritionally interesting cooking fats available. And then the carcass goes into the stock pot, and the cycle continues. The ritual of the Sunday chicken, roasted for the midday meal, served cold or in sandwiches on Monday, the bones going into the pot for Tuesday's soup, is a perfect model of complete food utilization that provides a different nutritional contribution at each stage. The roast on Sunday provides the high-quality protein and fat and vitamins of a freshly cooked whole animal. The cold meat on Monday provides the same in a different form, perhaps with a bit of real mayonnaise and some vegetables, or simply sliced and eaten with bread and butter. The broth on Tuesday provides the gelatin and minerals of the connective tissue and bones, the nutrient extraction that long simmering accomplishes. 3 meals from one chicken, each different, each contributing something real and nothing discarded. This is the kind of food management that the women of the 1950s had learned from their mothers and grandmothers, and that had been refined over generations toward maximum efficiency and nutrition, and the fact that it was done without any conscious nutritional intention at all, simply because it was what you did with a chicken, does not make it any less remarkable. Let me talk now about the relationship between the 1950s diet and specific aspects of women's health that are not always discussed in this context, but that are relevant to the complete picture. Hormonal health in the 1950s woman was, by available evidence, generally better than in subsequent generations in several specific ways. The rates of conditions now understood to be strongly influenced by diet and body composition, including polycystic ovarian syndrome, endometriosis, and hormonally driven cancers, were lower in mid-century women than in subsequent generations, though it is impossible to attribute this entirely to diet. The factors are multiple and complex, but the dietary pattern that supported adequate progesterone production, healthy insulin sensitivity, appropriate cortisol rhythm, and robust fat-soluble vitamin status was, from the perspective of hormonal health, considerably more supportive than the dietary patterns that replaced it. Progesterone, the hormone that counters the effects of estrogen and that is critical for regular menstrual cycles, mood stability and fertility, requires adequate dietary fat for its synthesis. Cholesterol, the precursor molecule from which all steroid hormones including progesterone are made, is obtained most efficiently from animal foods, the eggs and butter and meat and whole dairy that were central to the 1950s diet. A woman restricting dietary fat severely, as became fashionable in the late 1970s and 1980s, was restricting the raw material from which progesterone is made. The connection between very low-fat diets and hormonal irregularity, including amenorrhea and infertility, is well documented in women athletes and others who restrict fat intake to levels well below what traditional diets contained. Thyroid function is another area where the 1950s diet may have been genuinely supportive in ways that subsequent dietary patterns were not. The thyroid gland requires iodine to produce its hormones, selenium to convert the precursor hormone T4 to the active T3, zinc for receptor sensitivity, and adequate caloric intake and dietary fat for overall metabolic support. The 1950s diet provided iodine from whole dairy, from seafood, from the iodized salt that had become standard by this era. It provided selenium from meat and eggs and seafood. It provided zinc from meat and shellfish and eggs. and it provided adequate fat and calories from the animal foods that were central to the daily pattern. Hypothyroidism, while certainly present in the 1950s population, has increased substantially in subsequent decades, and while the causes are multiple and contested, the dietary changes of the intervening period are among the factors that nutritional researchers have considered. Skin health is perhaps the most visually obvious dimension of the fat-soluble vitamin story, and it is worth discussing explicitly. Vitamin A in the retinol form that animal foods provide is essential for the process of skin cell turnover, the regular replacement of old skin cells with new ones that keeps the skin clear and smooth and radiant. Vitamin A deficiency, even in its subclinical forms, manifests as keratosis pilaris, the small rough bumps that appear on the backs of upper arms and thighs, and that are remarkably common in contemporary populations. It manifests as skin that is dull and slow to regenerate, more prone to breakouts, less resilient to environmental stress. The retinoid compounds used in prescription skincare products are synthetic forms of vitamin A, used topically precisely because of their known effects on skin cell turnover, effects that dietary vitamin A produces systemically from within the body when intake is adequate. The women of the 1950s eating egg yolks and butter and liver and whole dairy every day were maintaining vitamin A levels that supported exactly this skin health from within, without the expensive serums and retinol creams that the modern skincare industry sells as the solution to the problem that inadequate dietary vitamin A helps create. There is a genuine irony in the fact that the same era's nutritional advisors, who eventually contributed to the removal of vitamin A-rich foods from the recommended diet, were creating conditions for the skin problems that the beauty industry would subsequently profit from treating. The strong nails and the thick hair that many women of the 1950s are photographically documented as having, features that modern women often spend considerable money trying to achieve through biotin supplements and specialty shampoos, are also related to the nutritional adequacy of a diet rich in protein, fat-soluble vitamins, and the B vitamins that are concentrated in eggs and meat and dairy. Hair and nails are made of keratin protein, and their growth and strength are supported by adequate dietary protein, by biotin from egg yolks, by the sulfur-containing amino acids that are most abundant in animal proteins. A woman eating 2 eggs and a portion of meat or fish every day was providing her hair follicles and nail beds with the raw materials they needed to produce strong, healthy tissues, not because she was taking a supplement, but because she was eating a diet in which these nutrients were present and bioavailable. Now let me bring the story toward its close by looking at a few specific women's experiences from the 1950s that put a human face on the dietary patterns we have been discussing. In the oral history archives of several American universities, and in the social surveys conducted in this era by researchers studying women's domestic lives, there are accounts of how women thought about and talked about their food. One consistent thread is the pride that women of this era took in their cooking knowledge, in the ability to make a good plain meal from modest ingredients, in knowing how to make the chicken last through the week, how to make the beans come out creamy and well-flavored, how to judge when the bread was ready by the sound of the crust. This knowledge was considered genuine expertise, transmitted from mother to daughter in the same way that any craft skill is transmitted, through demonstration and practice and the accumulated corrections of someone who knows better. Another thread is the unself-consciousness about food that characterized the era in ways that contrast sharply with the food anxiety of subsequent generations. Women in the 1950s, broadly speaking, ate what they made and made what they knew and didn't agonize over it. The concept of food as a source of existential anxiety, as a domain in which one could err in 1,000 different directions, and where the right path was always being updated and revised by competing authorities, had not yet fully arrived. You ate what your mother had taught you to eat, you ate it at meal times, you fed your family from the same tradition, and you didn't particularly worry about it. This unself-consciousness was possible in part because the food culture was stable in a way that it has not been since. The nutritional advice of the era was modest in its claims and largely consistent with what traditional food cultures had been saying for generations. Eat your vegetables, don't waste food, eat your protein, don't overindulge in sweets. These were not controversial claims. They were the common sense of the era, backed by generations of lived experience rather than contested clinical trials, and they were followed without particular drama because they were simply sensible. One woman whose food memories were recorded in an oral history project conducted at an Ohio university in the 1970s described her 1950s kitchen with a vividness that brings the whole thing into focus. She remembered the cold in the mornings before the furnace came up, and the first thing she did was put the kettle on. She remembered the particular smell of the icebox when she opened it in the morning, cold and slightly metallic, and like the wax paper the meat was wrapped in. She remembered cracking the eggs into the skillet and the specific sound they made against the hot fat. She remembered the way the butter melted in the green beans at the end of their cooking, how she'd swirl it in with a spoon before bringing the dish to the table. She remembered the exact weight of the roasting pan when it was full, and the way it required 2 hands to lift it from the oven. All of this was ordinary, all of this was Tuesday, none of it was particularly remarkable to her, which is exactly the point. The most nutritionally significant features of the era's food culture were entirely unremarked upon, invisible in their ordinariness, practiced without theory or explanation or the consciousness that they were anything other than simply what one did. The specific knowledge of how to roast a chicken so the skin crisped and the meat stayed moist, how to time the braise so the vegetables were tender without being mushy, how to make a white sauce that didn't lump, how to tell when the bread was done without a thermometer, how to render lard so it was clear and sweet-smelling rather than off and greasy. All of this was practical expertise in the management of whole foods, and all of it has diminished as the foods themselves have been replaced by products that don't require this kind of knowledge because they're already processed and standardized, and their behavior is predictable in ways that real ingredients are not. There is a famous essay by the food writer M.F.K. Fisher, writing about this era in which she lived and whose food she understood with extraordinary clarity, in which she talks about the pleasure of a good piece of cold chicken eaten with the fingers, standing at the refrigerator, in the kitchen, alone. It is a small and private pleasure, she says, and an entirely genuine one. The quality of the pleasure depends on the quality of the chicken, which depends on the fact that it was roasted properly from a good bird with good fat, and the fact that leftover cold roast chicken of genuine quality has a flavor and a texture that is simply one of the better things in the world. That pleasure, specific and sensory and entirely unadorned, is the pleasure of real food eaten in the way that food has always been eaten, without ceremony or complexity or the overlay of nutritional anxiety. It is available to anyone who roasts a good chicken and puts it in the refrigerator and eats some of it cold the next day with their fingers over the kitchen sink. The recipe has not changed, the food has not changed. What has changed is the context, and whether we allow ourselves the uncomplicated pleasure of it. Let me now speak directly for a moment, because I think something needs to be said plainly before we close. The story of the 1950s diet and what happened to it is not a simple story of the old ways being better. The women of the 1950s faced enormous constraints. Their diets were embedded in social structures that were in many ways unjust and limiting. The labor that produced those nutritious homemade meals was largely uncompensated and often unappreciated. The food culture of the era had genuine flaws, including the processed foods that were already beginning to appear and the racial and economic inequalities that determined who actually had access to the diet we have been describing. And many of the specific health outcomes of the era were worse than those of subsequent generations in areas unrelated to nutrition: higher maternal mortality, untreated chronic conditions, limited access to medications and diagnostic tools that have since saved millions of lives. What this story is a story about a dietary tradition that had genuine nutritional intelligence embedded in it, that worked for the bodies it was feeding, and that was replaced by a sequence of interventions, commercial, official, and cultural, that in several important respects worked less well. Understanding what was valuable in that tradition, not romanticizing the era that contained it, but understanding the specific nutritional mechanisms that made certain foods and practices beneficial, is worthwhile. Not because we can or should return to the 1950s, but because the principles themselves are available to anyone who chooses to apply them, in whatever form fits the reality of contemporary life. Real protein at every meal, dietary fat from whole food animal sources without irrational anxiety about it, regular consumption of eggs and liver and fermented dairy, real bone broth or gelatin as a regular presence in the diet, vegetables in variety, cooked in ways that make them satisfying, meals at regular times with genuine gaps between them, sleep at regular hours, physical activity woven into the daily routine in whatever form is available. These are not complicated requirements. They are the common sense of the era, validated now by research that has spent decades catching up to what tradition already knew. The woman at her counter with her cottage cheese and her canned peach and her cold glass of whole milk was not following a diet plan. She was eating what her mother had taught her to eat, what her body had always eaten, what the kitchen had always contained. She was not counting anything, she was not avoiding anything. She was just eating, the way people had always eaten, in the form that had been refined over generations toward the things that felt good and worked. And it did work. The evidence is in the photographs, in the health surveys, in the longevity data, in the metabolic research that has since explained the mechanisms. It is in the unremarkable Tuesday lunches and the Sunday chickens and the jars of sauerkraut in the refrigerator door and the stock pots simmering on the back of the stove. It is in all the small ordinary things that the women of that era did without thinking that we have spent decades trying to find our way back to, sometimes through expensive supplements and elaborate dietary protocols and the guidance of specialists who are, in many cases, simply rediscovering what was lost. The most important foods of the 1950s were not exotic. They were eggs and butter and liver and pickled vegetables and whole milk and bone broth and real meat and fermented dairy and slow-cooked beans and a piece of fresh fruit in the afternoon and a cup of tea before bed. They were the foods that every grandmother knew and that the food industry spent decades teaching people to replace with something newer and more profitable and in most respects less nourishing. They are not gone. You can still buy eggs and butter and liver and make your own sauerkraut and simmer bones in a pot. You can still eat at meal times and take the gaps between them seriously. You can still make soup from scratch and bake bread and roast a chicken and put the carcass in a pot with water and an onion. None of this requires a special budget or a special commitment or a special kind of person. It requires, more than anything, the knowledge that it is worth doing and the understanding of why it matters that this story has tried, in its long and winding way, to provide. The woman at her kitchen counter in 1953 had that knowledge without knowing she had it. It had been given to her, silently and completely, by every meal she had ever eaten and every kitchen she had ever stood in. She carried it forward without being aware of carrying it, and she fed her family from it without particular credit or ceremony. And then she went back to the other things the afternoon required. There is something beautiful in that, and something worth honoring. Not the era, with its real and genuine injustices and limitations, but the knowledge. The quiet, practical, unglamorous knowledge of how to feed a body well, passed from hand to hand through generations, embedded in the smell of a kitchen at 6 o'clock in the evening, and the sound of a pot on the stove, and the weight of a good piece of cold chicken in your hand. That knowledge is still available. It is waiting patiently in the kitchen. And on that note, wherever you are in the world right now, however late it is, I hope this long, slow journey through a particular moment in the history of food has given you something to take with you into tomorrow, something small and practical and maybe a little surprising. Thank you for spending this evening at Sleepy Old World. Thank you genuinely for every subscription and every comment and every night you've chosen to spend here. It means more than I can properly say. Sleep well, eat something real tomorrow, and I'll see you next time.